Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Explore.org's Polar Bear Can live chat. It's polar bear season here in Churchill, Manitoba. I'm Don Moore, and we're coming to you live from Polar Bears International Tundra Buggy 1 right here on the shores of Hudson Bay with our Arctic winds and polar bears right outside the buggy. With me are Dr. Megan Owen from San Diego Zoo Institute for Conservation Research, Dr. Cecilia Bitts, an internationally renowned climate scientist, and Dr. Andrew DeRoche, who has studied polar bears for over 30 years. And today we're talking about 5 things you need to know about polar bears and climate change. The program will last about 30 minutes, including time for questions and answers. And you can submit questions for our experts in the chat window. Beyond talking about the 5 things you need to know about polar bears, we'll also talk about how you can help polar bears, and we'd love to hear about what all of you are doing to increase your conservation actions. Post your conservation actions in our chat window, and we'll be able to share them during the live chat. For example, does your school use power strips to save energy, or compost its cafeteria waste, or have bike to school days? Tell us about it, and we'll tell the world about it. So, where are we? We're outside Churchill, Manitoba, on the shores of the Hudson's Bay, and for June through November, the 900 people who live in the town of Churchill really have to deal with the polar bears who kind of group up here waiting for the ice to form on Hudson's Bay. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that. Dr. Owen, I'd like to start with you with 5 things that people need to know about polar bear adaptations.
Sure. Well, polar bears have a number of physiological, morphological, and behavioral adaptations that help them survive in this incredibly harsh climate. One of the things I focus on a lot are polar bear feet. So polar bears have extra hairy feet, which help keep their feet warm, their bodies warm as they walk across the sea ice. It's very cold, obviously. They also have very, very large feet, which helps spread the weight as they walk, which is helpful when you're crossing across a variable thickness ice surface. They also have great sharp claws, very, very strong, which help them grip the ice and keep their traction. Their feet also have an adaptation on the skin where they have things that we call papillae, which is on the skin of the feet, and that helps them also gain extra traction on the sea ice. They also have adapted teeth, which are quite different from their brown bear ancestors. Brown bear are omnivore. Polar bear, of course, are carnivores. So polar bear teeth are specially adapted for our carnivores, effective at tearing meat and breaking that down in a form that can be digested easily by them. I think that was 5.
That was 5, and congratulations. And because I'm a master of the obvious, I'll add that polar bears are white and blend in perfectly with their white background, and brown bears are brown and blend in with that background. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later. Dr. Bitts, what are 5 things we should know about sea ice?
Well, sea ice is the air conditioner of the climate. It keeps the planet cold. It does that by reflecting a lot of the sunlight that comes in and returns it to space. And when the planet warms, the sea ice retreats and it exposes a very dark ocean surface, and that absorbs more sunlight. So the removal of sea ice actually adds to global warming. Another factor about sea ice that's important is that it's an ecosystem itself. Sea ice is actually porous, it's frozen seawater, and it traps salt in little pockets of liquid in the ice, so it's kind of spongy. And in those little pockets there's algae, and when the sea ice melts it deposits that algae into the ocean and it feeds the fish, and the fish feed and when the sea ice is on the continental shelf, because that's where the ocean waters are the richest and most biologically productive, and that's where the sea ice is retreating first. Sea ice is about as thick as a human is tall. Maybe a basketball player would be about the upper limit of the thickness of sea ice normally, except it can also, because it's somewhat thin, move and be very dynamic. It's not static. And when flows of sea ice crash together, they form ridges and deform. And those are also places where seals tend to hide, in among the ridges and the snow-covered parts of the ridges. And so polar bears tend to walk along the ridges and hide. A fourth item is that sea ice is in motion. And it's moving quite a lot across the Arctic every year. And as a result, when a polar bear wants to stay in space, in the place it's at, it has to walk like on a treadmill. And the last point is is that sea ice is changing. Since 1979, we've been observing it very effectively from space, and it's retreated by about 30-40%, somewhere in that neighborhood, in September. That's when it's retreating the fastest. And of course, that's really bad for polar bears because that's their habitat. And so next we're going to hear about polar bears more specifically.
Roger, 5 things about polar bears and ecology and their relationship to the sea ice?
You betcha. It's kind of hard to figure out what would be the top 5 things. I don't think this is necessarily the top, but some things you should know. Number 1 is that polar bears are found in the Arctic, and they're found in 5 different nations across the Arctic. So that would be, of course, Canada, where we are right now. Greenland is the next country over as we head east. Then we've got Norway, but not mainland Norway, Arctic Norway in the Svalbard area. And then we get, of course, polar bears right across the northern parts of Russia, and then, of course, in Alaska in the United States. And those are the 5 countries that have polar bears. Canada actually has the most polar bears, so we win on that score. We've got about 2/3 of them here, and that's part of the Canadian Arctic having lots of islands. The next thing we need to know is that polar bear populations, it's not one big group. The bears that are around us here in Churchill right now live here. These are sort of Churchill or Western Hudson Bay bears that really live in this area. And the bears that live here were born here. They come back here every year. So they show fidelity to this area. And so essentially, this is one of 19 different subpopulations across the Arctic. The populations or subpopulations vary in size. Some of them are very small with just a few hundred bears, and some are numbering in the several thousands. So one thing that's really important is when people say, well, polar bears in this area are doing really well, that's fine. But remember, there's 19 different scenarios being played out over time. So that's an important component. The next issue is you have to really think about polar bears as being a marine mammal. Right now they're on land, but this is not where they want to be. So it's a little bit like if you see a sea lion sitting on a beach, well, that doesn't make them a terrestrial mammal. It's just a marine mammal that's come on land. And that's pretty much what we're dealing with here. The next thing to really know, and I think it's number 4, is that polar bears get their energy from the marine environment. So they rely on seals as their prey, and that's really important to understand. It's actually the fat that they get from eating ring seals. That's the number 1 species for polar bears around the world. That's really what makes a polar bear tick. So when you see them on land here, sure, they can eat some kelp and berries and a few goose eggs, but I mean, that's the equivalent of having a few candies in your daily diet. It's not what makes you tick, or it better not be. But you get the idea. It's not really important in terms of their overall energy balance. So the bears that are on shore here are basically burning up fat. Last thing, polar bears aren't found in the Antarctic. So when you use ads with polar bears and penguins, no, they don't mix. Polar bears would be happy in the Antarctic if we put them to the Antarctic, but the other thing is that they'd create absolute havoc down there because those seals and penguins, of course, don't have any predators on top of the sea ice.
Thanks. Well, I think we all know that polar bears are one of the most iconic, magnificent animals on the face of the planet. And these guys just gave you 15 things about polar bears and climate. We'll take some questions. And here's one from Sea Bear Falls. And maybe Dr. DeRoche can take this and talk about the food chain. She says, is there an untapped food source for the polar bear that scientists are researching?
Untapped? Not really so much. I mean, polar bears will eat pretty much anything that they can find. I mean, it's amazing. They'll seek out things, and we watch them around here. Their noses are working overtime all the time. If there's something dead out there, they'll certainly find it and eat it. But when it comes to natural foods, polar bears evolved, and the whole reason that they went out onto the sea ice was to hunt seals. There was an untapped resource for the early ancestral polar bears that basically they went out there and found this source of food that nobody was eating. So it's a story of very rapid evolution from a grizzly bear, brown bear ancestry to go out onto the ice and take advantage of this hugely abundant resource. Ring seals, when you see them out in the spring, sea ice in the spring when they're hauled up on the surface, there's hundreds and thousands of them. They're one of the most abundant seals in the world. The only other seal that might come close is crab-eater seals in the Antarctic. But in the Arctic, they're just everywhere. And they're like this beautiful energy package if you're a polar bear.
And in zoos, sometimes we feed polar bears dog food and live fish. So the polar bears here wouldn't dive down and get Arctic cod if their seal prey kind of went the way of the polar bears going now. They go extinct because the ice goes extinct. They wouldn't go fishing, the polar bears.
There's not that many opportunities to go fishing, and of course, if you look around at, grizzly bears make a great living off of feeding off of fish and going into the rivers. There's not many places in the Arctic where fish are available, but there are some, and we have observations, and they do every so often go after fish. It's just not an easy way to make a living. If we could wind back time a few hundred years ago on the coast of Labrador, so pretty much straight to the east of us here in the northern part of the Atlantic, we had polar bears that would actually go fishing in rivers. And some of the very early explorers went in there and of course shot them all. And so that behavior is lost to us. But polar bears are adaptable, but I mean, those were even still for those bears, it was probably just kind of like a fun thing to do. It's not a big energy resource for them. So they can hunt and fish other things because they have access to seals. It's not the other way around. And it's also really important to remember that there is another bear that lives in the Arctic, in the barren grounds, and that's the barren ground grizzly bear. And they're tiny in comparison to polar bears, and they live almost the mirror opposite lifestyle. All the grizzly bears in the Arctic are going to sleep, and they'll be asleep for 6 months now in a hole in the ground, whereas polar bears are just getting revved up to get going. So there's polar bears use what they've got around them. They'll eat goose eggs and birds and just about anything else, sometimes even other polar bears.
Wow. Here are two questions. How fast can polar bears run and how fast can they swim?
They can run a lot faster than us. When we're catching them from a helicopter, we follow very closely behind them, and we've tracked them going just a little over 30 kilometers per hour, which puts it about 20 miles per hour. So not super fast, but you look at the structure of a bear. We've seen some bears running around here today. I mean, they're moving pretty quick, but they're not really built for speed. They're built for strength. So you look at the massive front limbs on these bears, the big paws. They cover huge distances, but they move pretty steady and pretty slow. But they are agile and pretty quick when they have to be. And when are they quick? Number one, when they're running from biologists in a helicopter. Number two is when they're trying to catch a seal. I've seen them hunting seals, and you see that seal come up, and you see the bear lock on, and it's like that first baseman diving. Because the seal's trying to get down a hole, and then they just get there. They just got to get a paw.
All right, we have a question about reproduction. After hearing about the peat dens used by pregnant females in summer, a question about delayed implantation. Do scientists have any theories about what ultimately triggers the fertile ova implantation in the fall? Is it a drop in temperature, a change in light, or?
I mean, we see delayed implantation in all bear species for the most part. There's variable length of the diapause, which is the period between fertilization and implantation. And we don't know what the signal is for implantation. In a lot of bear species, because most species, bears live on the edge of an energetic existence, challenging across the bear family to get enough fat stored, to go into a den, to go start your fast, to give birth to cubs and provide enough milk for those cubs. So I think some of the best hypotheses are that there is a nutritional signal, though we really don't know for sure what that might be.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just mention a lot of other species do have delayed implantation. So it's pretty common. You see it in some of the seal species and a lot of the members of the weasel family. So wolverines, marten, mink, and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting mammalian strategy that's found across lots of different groups. But the ecology of it and the evolution of it are one of those mysteries that are lost in time, because there's no fossil record to be able to record when it evolved and why it evolved. So it's hard to tell. One of the we can look at the hard parts of an animal from an evolutionary perspective, but the soft parts, the behaviors, are all lost to us in time.
Yeah. We have a question for Dr. Bitts. People suggest that there's nothing we can do personally about climate change. It's too big a problem. What's your opinion?
No, it's not too big a problem. humans are very creative, and I think we can solve this one if we all work together. There's a lot of things we can do as individuals. We can, choose public transportation and walking and bicycling. We can turn off the lights and turn off the appliances that we don't need. But I think we can also use our talents and gifts to create new and better solutions and work on the technology that we're going to need eventually to solve this one. And I hope that kids out there are interested in science and will pursue it, because we need all the help we can get, and it's a lot of fun.
Great. Here's another one for you, Dr. DeRoche. What are your thoughts on the growler or pizzly?
Oh, the pizzly, the growler bear, the nanukalak, it's all sorts of different things you want to call it. I mean, it's interesting. They definitely exist. We know now in the Canadian Arctic of at least 8. And it's interesting because these are fertile offsprings of a polar bear crossing with a grizzly bear. And what we know so far is that all of the fathers have been grizzly bears, all the mothers have been polar bears, and that's probably a function of the ecology of grizzly bears. And what we've had in the last number of years, we don't know how long it's been going on in the Canadian Arctic, which is the only place where we have them right now, but it looks like the male grizzlies moved off of the mainland of North America in Canada up into the Arctic archipelago, and they established themselves up there. And what's essentially happened is those males get up there, because males disperse a lot farther than females, and it's kind of lonely up there in the springtime when it's mating season, and they're probably moving around, they're looking for things to eat, and all of a sudden they cross the tracks of a female polar bear. And as we've discussed earlier this week, a lot is that they are an olfactory animal. They track out other bears, and they certainly find their mates using scent. So I think when a male grizzly bear crosses the tracks of a female polar bear and estrus, it's, as they say, love is blind. So eventually they meet up, and then you get these little cubs, and they kind of look like that perfect blend. They kind of not quite grizzly bear, not quite polar bear. In the high Arctic, far out on the edge of the sea ice, and we think he was probably 3/4 grizzly bear, 1/4 polar bear. But until we do the genetics, we're not sure. But we have some definite 3/4 grizzly bear, 1/4 polar bear offspring out there. So it looks like the hybrids go back to mating with grizzly bears, not going on and mating with polar bears. But it's quite possible it could. So it's an interesting event, but we have lots of hybrids in the wild. So we get lynx and bobcat, coyotes and wolves, sometimes mule deer, and we see it. It's a common thing in the wild. What it really means from an evolutionary perspective is that those two species haven't been apart long enough to have that reproductive isolation. And it's probably because polar bears and grizzly bears keep crossing over, and we know of several other events much farther back in time when the two species have hybridized. So it's something that we hope that polar bears are around long enough that eventually they won't be able to breed with grizzly bears, but we're talking a long time into the future.
Great. My iPad says it needs to cool down. So it's pretty cold out here. I don't know why it needs to cool down. The question that was on the iPad at the time was one about smell. How far can polar bears smell, and how good is their sense of smell?
Well, there's lots of anecdotal information about polar bears' sense of smell, and that they can pick up the scent of a seal from tens of miles. I don't think we really know that for sure right now, but we do know, as Andy was mentioning before, that polar bears have a really finely tuned sense of smell, and they use it to find other bears. Like other solitary mammals, scent is their best way to know who else is around. If you think about it, you're solitary. Polar bears roam over as much as 600,000 square kilometers. That's a really, really big range. But when it comes time to breed, they have to be able to find a mate. And again, polar bears living on the edge of their energetic capacity, they can't be inefficient in that process. And so finding the tracks in the snow that were left by another polar bear with some of that scent left behind allows them to distinguish between a male and a female, or if it's a female, whether she has cubs with her or not, and might be a good reproductive partner. So that's just the beginning of what we know about their sense of smell. And these are all lines of study that we hope to embark upon to really get a better understanding of that.
And so as the sea ice breaks up, that might be a little problem for that
Yes,
sense of smell.
absolutely. So if you think about the sea ice and the trail that is left behind by another polar bear, with every piece of sea ice that's broken up between the trail that was left by another bear, it makes it that much harder to follow that trail. And so we can only assume that it's going to be harder and harder for polar bears to efficiently find a mate during the breeding season if this trend in sea ice breakup continues.
That sort of brings up an interesting point. I think we were discussing the other day that the rate of sea ice drift is actually increasing in a lot of areas.
Yes.
So how do you think that might come about?
Well, when the ice is thinner and more open, it's not a continuous sheet of ice. There's actually quite a lot of openings, and as it becomes more open, it's more mobile. It's, like you can imagine if you had something floating in a glass of water, if it was like marshmallows in hot chocolate. If you didn't have very many, they can move around a lot, but if they're very dense, they're going to lock up and not be terribly mobile.
That hot chocolate was
Oh, it
sounded.
sounds really good.
That sounded pretty good right now. Polar Bears International really wants to see polar bears in the Arctic always, and so we're hearing about the breakup of the sea ice, which is their prime habitat and the critical habitat. We can do something personally to help save our sea ice. So I'd like each of you to say what you're doing personally to help save sea ice and help conserve habitats around the world. Dr. DeRick.
One of the simple ones in our house is we've got the thermostat set really low. And when we're in our house, we wear warm slippers and we got big sweaters or fleeces on all the time. It's amazing. I mean, your house can be plenty comfortable. Just turn the thermostat down, save a lot of energy, and it's a wonderful thing. I mean, you don't need to be living at the temperatures that we do, and it's an odd one, but especially in the north here, we go to places and they're incredibly warm. People just keep their places way hot in the north. It's really bad. It's time to turn those thermostats way down and throw on a sweater.
One of the great things about doing good things for the climate is often it's really good for you too. Like I bicycle to work every day, but I also have a big garden, and it's just the best because I grow fresh tomatoes and fresh basil, and we just have to walk outside the door to pick it. And, it's not being shipped from long distances, so that's a really great way. It's good for you.
And one of the things I do as a biologist, we have all sorts of opportunities to travel, and for conferences, for research, for meetings. One of the things I've made a commitment to this year is to travel less. And so I'm taking advantage of technology. I'm having more Skype meetings, more other, using that technology to help me reduce my carbon footprint. And I'm working also hard at spreading the word that it took us a long time to get into this situation. It's going to take a long time for us to get out of this situation. And so we can't lose hope. We need to make sure that all of us are contributing these individual behaviors to improve the situation.
And I also grow my own food and support my local farmers. I think it's really important to take a good look at your food and make sure that everything in your food is sustainable, and think about the carbon footprint of your food. Supporting a local farm is a great way to reduce your carbon footprint and support your local farmer and your local fruits and vegetables. I'd like to thank everybody for being here with us today. We've got more chats this week. We'd like to thank Explore.org. Frontiers North Tundra Buggy Adventures. We're coming to you live from Tundra Buggy 1, and all of our other sponsors, including Canada Goose, which made these fine parkas that are keeping us a little bit warm here today. And just hope for ice. It's getting colder, and the ice is coming. It's not here yet, but hope for ice.